I have the pleasure today of being joined by Dr. Markus Krebber, CEO of RWE. RWE is an iconic German power utility founded 126 years ago in 1898 with just 1 megawatt of capacity. Since its inception as a coal-based power utility in Essen, RWE has undergone several transformations. The most recent one is from a vertically integrated power utility driven by conventional energy to a power generation pure play driven by clean energy. Today, RWE employs around 18,000 people, revenues around 40-something billion euros, market capitalization of about 23 billion euros, capacity of around 46 gigawatts, about 40% in Germany, 20% UK, roughly 20% US, and 20% rest of the world. The global number 2 in offshore wind, number 2 in the US for solar, number 3 in the UK, and number 4 in Europe for wind and solar. And last year, in 2023, RWE was named Energy Company of the Year by S&P Global Commodity Insights at the Global Energy Awards. That's about RWE. A few words about Markus. He studied economics and business in Duisburg before going to work in management consulting and then in banking while completing his PhD in Berlin. After various senior positions at Commerzbank, including COO of their private clients division, Markus joined RWE in 2012, serving first as CFO, then CEO of the supply and trading division, then to become Group CFO in 2016 and Group CEO in 2021. Markus, thank you for taking the time to join us and warm welcome.
Jean-François, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
So we will try to proceed in 3 parts. First, industry/society, then the company, RWE itself, and then of course you as its top leader. So let me start with a few questions on the industry and its relevance to society. So we all know that the world needs to dramatically increase energy production coming from renewable sources. So we had hydro, we now have solar and wind on a large scale, we have biomass on a smaller scale, and hopefully hydrogen on an increasing scale over the next few years. We also have massive future growth in electricity consumption over the next few years. I think in Europe, we're looking at plus 60% by the end of the decade, triggered in fact by a number of factors, including, of course, the growing transition to electric vehicles, and also the growth of technology-related electricity consumption, for example, data centers, which are exploding in capacity in part because of the developments of AI. So, Markus, can you give us an idea of the order of magnitude of the investments that will be needed to increase renewable energy production to the level where we need it by the end of the decade and beyond?
Yeah, Jean-François, I will not entertain now numbers because, it depends on how broad you look at it and also what the time horizon is. But what is clear, and you already said it, we need massive investments into the energy systems for decades to come. And that has 2 reasons. On the one hand side, we have underinvested the energy supply system for quite a time. Not only on the renewable side where it's obvious, but actually also on other elements like gas and others. And we need to invest into this new technology. So the task of today is how do we channel these investments into the right energy supply system? And of course, that needs to be clean technology or those technology which has a clear pathway to become clean. But just to reiterate, you mentioned already a couple of them, but where we need additional investments, it's not only renewables, it's storage technologies, it's backup capacity to supply security of supply. It's building the hydrogen economy, not only hydrogen production, but also transportation and storage. It's CCS, so carbon capture and storage, the technology itself, the transportation, the final storage, EV charging, heat pumps, and then additional downstream investments for those sectors which need to electrify, like direct reduced iron and steel, but also green chemicals. And so the investments we have ahead of us for probably 5 decades are significant.
A question I wanted to ask you later, but let me ask it immediately because I think you just alluded to it. A number of folks, when they talk about energy transition and moving to a more sustainable world, think of degrowth. Let's reduce growth, let's reduce investment. What I'm hearing from you is, look guys, if we want to move to cleaner energy, we're going to need to build, which in fact is the way you put it in an article of yours I read recently.
I strongly oppose the solution of degrowth. Degrowth will definitely not work for 2 reasons. I mean, on the one hand side, the history of mankind is a history of growth. People strive to get a better life, a safer life, more prosperous, more healthy, and therefore you need to have growth, because growth always means you need to save. Without savings, you cannot invest, because then you just consume. So, and how should we, and that is the other aspect, how on earth should we invest all this money into clean technologies if we have no growth? Then you need to cut significantly into consumption. If you cut into consumption, that is against the will of the people to have a better life tomorrow than they have today. So I think we can only afford all these investment with significant economic growth.
Now, are we on track? Is the world investing enough, or are we indeed running late on where we should be?
It always depends. I mean, if you set certain climate targets as a given, and you do not have to find priorities with other topics, then of course we could say we are probably behind, because we are not on a 1.5 degree compliant pathway. But who has factored in that, especially in the West, we now have to put additional money into defense because we have seen unforeseen military aggressions? If you factor that all in, you need to also think who will save all the money which we need to invest in defense and climate protection, but also our social system, other infrastructure. And there I would say it's also important that we don't lose the focus on climate protection, because the moment we stop, we will get into significant problems. I said we need investment in the energy system. These investments need to be in clean technology. The moment we stop, we save some money, but we're going to have climate problems and we're going to have problems with an underinvested energy supply system.
So, what are some of the hurdles to accelerating this transition to renewable energy sources, which, as we just discussed, is necessary from a climate perspective, but also potentially a fantastic source of economic growth?
The typical bottlenecks you talk about, let's go through them. One is potentially capital. I don't see it. The moment you have a good business case, you get capital into clean technology. So for the moment, I would say capital, even in a higher interest rate environment, is not the biggest problem. Second, of course, is talent. We need people. We need engineers, we need mechanics, we need commercial guys. And that, of course, I mean, we have the tight labor markets everywhere, is one of the bottlenecks. To give you an example, we currently grow our workforce in our core business at 10% per annum, because we think that is a maximum you can do without losing culture, without losing quality. So this is a limiting factor. The other limiting factor I currently see is supply chain. If you look at our turbine manufacturers, battery manufacturers, they need to ramp up capacity, and some of them are not in the best condition to spend money on expanding capacity. That is another bottleneck. And the third one, which is very important, is affordability. How much people are willing to pay, because in the end, either the energy consumer or the taxpayer via support schemes need to pay for it. And the faster you go, the more expensive it will become. And here we should not overstretch, because then we lose the support of the people for the transition ahead of us.
And indeed, we see that this support is quite fledgling because, of course, intellectually, all voters want cleaner energy, but then concretely, they get quite annoyed when prices increases. So you're quite right. Now, the cost of renewable energy had decreased substantially over the last few years, and had become, in fact, very comparable, in fact, lower than some of the traditional thermal energy sources. But costs have increased over the last 2-3 years for solar panels and also for wind turbines. Are these cost increases another hurdle that you face in this transition?
I would not say it's a specific hurdle for investments in clean technologies, because what are the reasons why prices have gone up? We have two major drivers of that. One is inflation, and that affects everything, right? I mean, inflation is not only in our business, inflation is in all infrastructure business, or it's in housing and everywhere. And inflation was driven up by general inflation, by scarcity of raw materials, and geopolitical tensions which affected the supply chain. I mean, and then we had COVID also affecting the supply chains. And the second driver was higher interest rates. We are a massively capex intensive business. So most of the money we spend in capital expenditure and very little OPEX of the lifetime of the project. And there, of course, higher interest rates means higher costs because you need to earn more money on the capital you put upfront into it. But as I said, that is affecting all kinds of infrastructure and things. So it's simply that the cost of living have gone up, and that is also true for energy.
Now, you mentioned geopolitical forces. Some of these geopolitical forces, especially in the US, are pressuring organizations to reduce access to Chinese producers. And as it happens, Chinese producers happen to have lowest cost on solar panels and also arguably, although there's some debate on how much subsidies they're receiving, on wind. How much of an issue is this political pressure for you to reduce access to Chinese suppliers?
I would not say it's a problem per se. I think it's a question how we approach it. Because if we cannot get Southeast Asian equipment, the question is, where does it come from? If it comes from the West, it takes some time to build supply chain. Let's take the US example, which you already mentioned. There is a clear steer from the US government that they want to bring back supply chain for solar panels and batteries in the US. But that's not going to happen overnight. So what you want is predictability. Because if you have your construction sites waiting for batteries and solar panels, and then you stop all imports overnight, you're going to have a delay by 5 years, because that is what it probably takes to build your local national supply chain. But if you have that certainty and you have the time to bridge it, you can build it, of course. And we have already placed orders with future solar manufacturing companies in the US to support them building their sites. But as I said, it needs lead times. And the other element you rightly said, it's probably more expensive than what you can import. But that's a political question. How much independence do you want? That is not energy specific.
Now, wind and solar, of course, are great sources of renewable energy, but they're also intermittent. It needs to be complemented, in particular, I guess, with flexible energy sources and also storage system. How can you mitigate? So first of all, what are these systems, and how do you mitigate the carbon footprint of these solutions?
You're absolutely right. We have to distinguish on the one hand side generation and on the other side firm capacity. And with a build-out of renewables, most of the generation will come from decarbonized or non-carbon carrying renewable energies. Wind, solar, hydro, biomass. But then you need also backup capacity in case you don't have enough power from renewable sources. And here the most relevant ones are on the short-term battery and long-term gas-fired generation. The beauty of gas is, other than coal-fired power generation, it will not become a stranded asset, because the infrastructure can also be used over time with decarbonized molecules. So that is the advantage of gas. So our task is, especially here in Germany, where we want to replace nuclear and coal, we need significant gas-fired power generation, and then over time we need to run it on decarbonized molecules.
Carbon capture and storage, part of the picture, including for these gas-fired plants?
That's in the end a question of the economics, right? I mean, if you have high running hours of a gas plant, probably there is an economic case for carbon capture and storage. But if you have the majority being generated by renewables and these gas plants are only for backup and they only run a couple of 100 hours, then it doesn't make sense to put CCS to the plant. Then you better go to hydrogen.
Now, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the US have established a pretty clear framework and roadmap with respect to this energy transition. European regulators have not yet established as favorable or as predictable a framework. And of course, as we know, uncertainty tends to lead to reduced investment. In your view, what should European regulators do more or less to help the industry to accelerate its transition?
And this is probably a question which alone we could debate for an hour. Let's maybe elaborate a bit on how the system differentiates. In both markets, in the US market as well as in the European market, you have a clear incentive to channel your investment into clean technology. The US, as you pointed out, does it with the IRA, with tax incentives for clean technologies. And also, I mean, with some elements of an incentive to build a local and national supply chain. In Europe, we, by the way, have also a clear incentive to channel the investment into decarbonized technologies. This is the price of carbon. It makes fossil more expensive. In certain markets, you have CFDs, contracts for difference for renewables, so you get a guaranteed power prices. So we have different elements. I think the big difference here is the US approach is very simple because the moment you produce a green kilowatt hour or you produce a green kilogram of hydrogen, you know exactly what kind of support you get, and it's quite stable for some years. From a government point of view, it's a small government approach because you give up some tax income. The European approach is different. You price carbon. Price of carbon is unknown for the future, so you have uncertainty how you can in your calculation base. But you raise taxes. But of course, you need these taxes to channel back some of the money as subsidies because US is making power cheaper on average. Europe is making it more expensive because taxing. Yeah? The money is not gone, it's there, but the European approach is clearly more big government. You channel more money from carbon taxing through government budget, which they can spend to support industry. So what I would say is if Europe should move, it should make things more predictable and more long-term. I mean, it's very difficult to apply for a support scheme under the European IPCEI program. It sometimes takes 3 years. And that, of course, is not bad in terms of incentive, but it takes so long and it delays investments. And here the US is moving faster. So we have to make it more simple, and we have to shorten the timeline where you know and can predict what kind of support you're going to get.
Now, one of the additional aspects that sometimes has been mentioned is the issue of permitting, getting permits for some of these renewable energy facilities. I understand that, for example, there's 4 times as much wind farm production being examined currently than there is actually under construction. So there's permitting for the wind farms and the solar farms itself, but then there's also permitting for increasing grid capacity, which is a major issue because renewables require more grid capacity. So can governments facilitate further permitting?
Yes, and I think here we definitely make, and we see that across all European markets, same is actually true also for the US, we see progress. I think politicians have now understood that permitting is a big problem because we cannot give the permits ourselves or the seabed lease or whatever, and they speed things up. And I would say I have over the last quarters clearly seen a sentiment change. You don't find hardly anybody who want to be responsible for delaying renewable projects in an authority or even in a courtroom and so on. So things are moving in the right direction. The bigger problem is acceptance of the people. Do they accept that a wind farm is placed next to their village? Yeah? Because not the problem, but the challenge with renewable energy is it needs significant more space than these concentrated nuclear and coal plants.
Can the governments do more/better in this area? Can companies like yours help? How will we help greater acceptance?
What we see, Jean-François, is 3 things. What helps? You need very early engagement with the communities. They want to have a say. And sometimes it's even helpful to move something, I don't know, 500 meters that direction or that direction. So if you just present a plan and they should approve it, it's very difficult. So very early community engagement. That is number 1. Second thing is you need to give them some kind of benefit. You have some US municipalities where you can then give them extra money, extra taxes, they can build a new school, they can upgrade their firefighters, so they see the immediate benefit. It's always very problematic when the taxes only end up in the federal budget and are channeled back into, in opaque ways to the community, so direct benefit. And the third one, which is very important, and there I see why governments want to bring back local supply, is people want to understand where are the good jobs in that business. If they don't see the good jobs, you have a problem with accepting these investments.
I recorded a dialogue with the CEO of Aqua Power, a Saudi-based company focused on renewable energy and desalination of water. One thing that struck me in that discussion was the extraordinary level of ambition. They basically want to triple their investments over the last 7 years. And sometimes when I read about our projects in Europe, we're happy when we do 10% more or 15% more. And so as I was comparing this to triple over 7 years, I thought to myself, have we lost some of this entrepreneurial drive? What are we missing to be more ambitious?
First of all, they start from a smaller base. But on the other hand, let's also be clear, we just discussed it. Renewable energy needs significant space. And we are all here living, Switzerland, Germany, East Coast US, in very densely populated areas. So you have limitations. If you now go to the Middle East, especially Saudi, which you mentioned, they have plenty of space, not populated, great resources for renewables. So these places, these companies, these countries will actually invest in more renewable power than they need. They will produce green molecules and they will export them to us. They're actually replacing their fossil business by green business. So I think it makes perfect sense.
Now, that's one approach, which is that indeed instead of exporting oil, or in addition to exporting oil, they can export green hydrogen, for example. Now, one of the questions that as I was preparing for these discussions was how efficient will it be to transport green hydrogen? And one of the ideas that has been mentioned is, but instead of transporting green hydrogen, will some of the hard to abate sectors actually move capacity there? Could we have green steel production there? Could we have green aluminum production there? As opposed to having it in Europe where, as you said, for in part physical reasons, it's going to be more difficult for us to produce green energy very cheaply.
I think you are raising exactly the right point. If we compare the two systems, the old fossil energy system and the future green energy system, in the fossil world, transport costs do not matter. Transporting oil or gas via pipeline or LNG tanker, transporting hard coal on a bulk carrier. The transportation costs are not relevant in the end consumer price. So location doesn't matter so much. So that's why we still have a very energy intensive business in places like Japan, South Korea, Germany, northern Italy, because you can transport the needed energy into these regions. That will unfortunately change with green energy, because green energy is much more difficult to transport. And in the end, it's an economic equation we need to solve, and you are absolutely right. Maybe for certain instances, it's much cheaper to transport green direct reduced iron, green aluminum, green hydrogen, green ammonia, instead of transporting the green energy.
So thank you for this. Let me move to RWE now, if I may. Now, RWE was created as most energies company as an integrated operator producing and distributing electricity. And then in 2018, and you were CFO at the time, RWE engaged in a bold asset swap with E.ON, one of your German competitors. Can you please tell it briefly, first, what was swapped? And then I'll ask you why.
So I can also try to answer it in one. Okay. The old energy world in the Western world was fully integrated utilities, covering generation, fossil as well as renewables, distribution, energy-intensive customer, and the network, so the wires. But when you look into it, and especially with the transition, we found out two things and realized. One is there are literally no synergies between power generation and grids. No synergies, totally separate teams, not even sharing a platform. And second, both needed significant investments. So significant investments into transforming fossil into green generation and significant network investments. And that was difficult under one company. And therefore the solution for us here was, let's split along the value chain. Our friends from E.ON now focusing on networks and the retail supply business, and we are focusing on generation storage and the energy intensive industry, and of course also supplying the E.ONs and peers. And the reason was more focus, and you now can fund the investments. One company invests into generation, one company invests into networks. Having both in one company is difficult because you overstretch you on the investment side.
Now, then on the heels of this transaction, you announced an ambitious growing green strategy. Please tell us what it involves.
It's actually, three elements. We want to invest more than 50 billion euros in clean technologies until the end of the decade. By that, our portfolio, which you mentioned is in the 40 gigawatts, will grow to 65, and it's a net growth, so it will also replace everything which we phase out until then, so significant gigawatt growth. And we want to maintain and even strengthen our very good market position in our core markets in the US, in the United Kingdom and the European Union.
Now, you just mentioned the geography. Growing Green aims to change the geographical footprint relatively significantly, if I've understood correctly, where you'll reduce Germany and increase US and UK. Why?
Now we discussed the transaction that we now focus on generation and wholesale market. And that means you still want to have a stable business, and a stable business is a business which is well diversified. So we are striving for a better diversification in terms of technologies, currently a focus on solar, and we also want to have a geographical diversification. And Germany will still account for 20 to 25% of our business, also in 2030, after all the investments. And the US is probably 30% of our business. But please also consider that the US, where we also have a leading position, is a power market which is 5 times as big as Germany.
Now, speaking of the US, you made a very large acquisition there in 2022. You bought the clean energy business from Con Edison for basically $7 billion. So you mentioned it's a huge market, but clearly this is renewable, it's a clean energy business. Walk us through the rationale, please.
Yeah, so our core markets were always the mature Western markets where we feel comfortable investing billions for decades. As I said, European Union, United Kingdom and the US. And in the US we had the weakest position, and our US position was solely an onshore wind position. We were building our offshore business from scratch organically, which worked very well, but we wanted to have a bigger US position and also an equivalent solar position. And therefore Con Ed, clean energy business, was the right target strategically. And now we have combined it, and now we have the position also in the US market we want to have. Building that organically would have taken more than a decade.
How easy is it to integrate such a large organization?
So looking back into the history of RWE, we have done so many bigger transactions. This, of course, being one of the bigger ones, so we are actually used to integrate businesses. The specific point here was, of course, the US business needs a special treatment, so to say, because you have the time and distance difference, right? It's not something which like integrating a UK business or a Polish business. And we needed to give the US business a bit more independence. So in the end, it was more an integration of the two US businesses in the US and not an integration into the full RWE group.
And now the plan is to divest completely out of coal by 2030, if I understand correctly.
Yes, we are the first company in Germany who exited hard coal power generation a couple of years ago, and we have an agreement with the government also to exit brown, our lignite coal business.
Now, on this front, Markus, I cannot not ask you about Lützerath and Garzweiler, where you've had very significant public debates with opponents to the open mine. And I know that you won in court, but this was highly controversial, very public. How do you approach such a situation as a CEO?
I do understand the question here that when you have a clear path to invest billions in clean technology and you want to become a green company as fast as possible, that people ask, why do you actually then continue the coal business and also have to do it sometimes in a way that you get very, very bad negative publicity and press coverage? But the truth is also, Jean-François, we can only close down existing power generation capacity when we have built new one. We cannot close down before we have built new one, because that would mean we have not enough power in Germany. We would even not be allowed to close things before we can actually exit the market. And we are committed to exit our fossil business as fast as possible. And we are actually working on making that possible with all our investments into green technology, into alternative backup capacity. But the truth is also, you first have to build new before you can exit the old, and we are not there, unfortunately.
You know, as I'm listening to you, it reminds me of a sentence that the then health minister in Switzerland during the COVID crisis became very famous for. He said, we're going to do this as fast as possible, but as slowly as necessary. And I guess that's what I'm hearing is we're going to do this as fast as possible, but also as slowly as necessary in order to continue to ensure energy supply.
Sure, and also you need to think about the people who are affected, because it also has social consequences. But this is currently not the limiting factor, because we have clear agreements how we deal with our people in a very socially acceptable manner.
Understood. Now, as you may know, Markus, I'm a leadership professor, so I cannot conclude this conversation without asking you a few personal questions. The first one, why join RWE? You were working in consulting and then in finance. Everything was going really well. Why quit banking to go work for an energy company?
I have to go back into the early 2000s. I was in a bank, I mean, as you said, responsible for many different roles. You said Chief Operating Officer of the retail business. And we that time also did one of the biggest banking mergers in Germany, merging bank number 2 and 3. I was responsible for the full integration. And then I became the director for finance. And then the financial crisis hit us. And I was responsible for the financial restructuring, recapitalization, and you can imagine that was not a fun job. And when we were half through and the bank was stabilized, I said, I'm up for something new. When people know that you are up for something new, that you're going to be approached. And then it was more by accident that via a headhunter, I was approached for RWE. I had meetings. I was very enthusiastic. As you said, I joined trading, which is probably closest to banking and energy than you can get to. And I never imagined to get into the role I'm currently having. I was already happy joining the trading business that day. Yeah, it was a fantastic move, because I had to start with something I didn't understand. I didn't know anybody. I didn't understand the corporate language. So as a learning exercise in a very progressed state of your career, it was a fantastic experience.
So that's the benefit for you. You said great learning exercise. Was it a benefit to be an industry outsider in the trading, but also when you became CEO, CFO and now CEO? Has it helped you to come from a very different way of thinking about the business?
I still remember the first weeks in RWE and in energy as a layman, more or less, right? And I asked myself, I mean, I don't understand anything. Why do they pay me so much money? I have no contribution. But then, of course, it also triggers that you start learning very fast and you ask questions. And by asking questions, you start understanding. And I think maybe there was an element of benefit for both sides, for me and the company, because when in the energy companies these days, I mean, we face significant challenges with moving into green technologies, clean technologies, new regulatory environment, especially significant pressure from the public and NGOs given the CO2 emissions. And the beauty, of course, for an outsider is you were allowed to ask stupid questions, which in the end turned out not to be so stupid.
Right. Now, you were CFO for 5 years before becoming CEOs. That's not an uncommon path, CFO first and then CEO. What remains from your CFO position? What has helped as a CEO? And what have you had to change? Have you had to change some reflexes, some ways of approaching questions?
I think what helped definitely, knowing energy through the commercial lens in trading, become the CFO first and then the group CEO is, with the CFO role, you do see the entire group. So you are not coming from a CEO of one division to CEO of the group. Right. Because in this interim step, you understood really all the businesses, of course, through the financial lens, but that, of course, gave you a much better starting position because you already understood all the different divisions and not only the one you run before. And that was a big advantage.
Is there anything that was not a big advantage? Is there any aspect where you're thinking, yeah, where you're now telling your CFO, yeah, I understand, but we're still going to do it this way? For example, different attitude toward risk?
I would say I'm probably a too risk-affine person to be a good CFO. So I think we have a very excellent CFO now, and he's a bit more risk-averse than I am, and that is good.
So that's the complementarity indeed between the two. Now, 2022 was was a drama in Ukraine, but this triggered a relatively significant energy crisis in Europe, including in Germany. As a leader, how did this impact you? And was there an insight or two that you got out of this very difficult situation?
With hindsight and reflection, three things stand out for me. One is when the war broke out, this unfortunately aggression by Russia, and the immediate impact on the energy market were on the horizon. I mean, the worst thing hit us in summer, not in February, but we could already see it coming. So we were living in a world of unforeseen uncertainty and volatility. And the second aspect of that is you ask yourself question about, robustness of the group, decisions you're going to face, stopping all business with Russian counterparties immediately, giving up the gas supply, things like that. And you knew exactly you needed to take these decisions under very high uncertainty very fast. Yeah, with significant consequences. It could have gone wrong or right. We got it right, I think, most of the time. But to create a team environment where you gather all information which is available in the group, but you still know, you probably only know 30-40%, and then you have to take a decision because waiting is not a solution. It's in the end also a decision and sometimes the wrong decision. So under this uncertainty, getting to good decisions. Second topic of the energy crisis, we as a German energy company were also, in high demand of the government to advise them, but also to help them to avoid a severe energy crisis. So we had to bring back significant capacity, which was already close on the power generation side. We were the first one proposing floating LNG terminals, getting the ships, getting the infrastructure within months that we could import LNG into Germany, which so far had no LNG terminal. And then the third one is still not losing sight in all this chaos of your objectives, which is the green transition. So even in the midst of the crisis, we did the big US acquisition and we agreed with the German government to exit coal by 2030. Yeah, so long term, it was not about the crisis. Long term, it was sticking to your strategic plan. And I'm very proud of the team that we actually managed it all. Right?
You're very modest and saying I'm very proud of the team. Some teams, like you, managed to find the right balance between short-term and long-term, offense and defense, whether it was during COVID or during this crisis. Other teams do not manage to find the right balance. Any idea why your team managed to find this right balance?
What benefited us is the group structure we have. We have a very decentral structure. So we have only a small holding company, which is run by the holding board, 3 people. And we focus on strategic things and capital allocation. And all the businesses, we have 6 big business units, they are run by their own boards, more or less independent. They have their own HR department, own legal department. So they don't rely too much on central steering, central resources. And by that, you create an environment where you have a lot of intelligence and knowledge and also independence and autonomy in the different businesses. So all the nitty-gritty in crisis management was done without group involvement. We could really focus on the big decisions, and that in the end helped. So it was probably not best coordinated, but we could definitely use all the intelligence in the group to cope with the crisis.
Interesting. So a better definition, a better separation between the tactical and the strategic. Correct. Because of the structure of the group. Now, being CEO of an organization as large, as complex, as challenging, and as politically exposed as RWE is very demanding. And maintaining yourself at peak performance at all time cannot be simple. Can you share with us 2 or 3 practices that help you to remain at your best, including through 2 years of COVID and then 2 years of Russia-Ukraine conflict-triggered energy crisis?
I think in that leadership position at the top of a company, you always need to operate in a way that you have reserves. You cannot operate at 100% capacity all the time, because you need the 100% the moment you get into an unforeseen crisis. So when you have normal operations, I would say I have always kind of 15-20% reserves. That also calms you down, because you know even when a crisis comes, you have some more to put into it. Second is what I use is time boxing. So I do define the time I want to spend with the family, with friends, for myself. Because if you don't do that, your job always eats into that. And then the rest is the time which remains is for the job. And that is then a question of prioritization, delegation, and having the great teams. And that works.
You say no a lot?
I learned to say no much more often than 5 years ago.
Markus, last question. You love your job because?
I love my job because it's very challenging, intellectually challenged, but you also can have real impact. I think what we are doing is changing the energy world, and this real impact is very exciting. And then when you look at the business, very big investments in newest technology, newest clean technology, in a very international environment with very agile team. I mean, that's most of the time a lot of fun.
Markus, thank you very much. Best wishes of continued success, including, of course, on helping the world continue to accelerate the energy transition that we need. Thank you so much.
Jean-François, thank you. It was a pleasure.